Well, good morning. It's time to get started. For those of you who are here, welcome. And if you're viewing from home, we'd like to welcome you to this first hour where we're studying 1 Corinthians. And just before we get started, we'll consider those that need our prayers. Call your attention to the bulletin, Sandra, Pat's family, Jean, she's here today. Jean's here. Leonard, can't hear me at all. Okay. I'll speak a little louder.
Okay, thank you.
Jean, Leonard, John, Lois, Regina's family, Mike, is not in the bulletin, urinary tract infection, and Betty, who's traveling to New York to see her son play basketball. And I've been watching him on TV because I'm a basketball fan. Mark, so I won't pray for that team. That's not my team, but my team's out anyway. Any other announcements or prayers? All right, let's begin with prayer. Most gracious, loving Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning praising you for the comforts of this building that we enjoy, that we should never take for granted, that we can talk about you in freedom without being molested. We thank you for those that defend our freedom here and abroad, and for those that carry out the gospel message. And some of those are under stressful times. We think of those countries that are experiencing war at this time and cannot enjoy the fruits of your labor. Father, as always, we ask you to consider those that are here and those that are not here, those that are physically ailing, those that need your spiritual help. For all this we ask in the blessed name of Jesus. Amen. I forgot one more thing. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Chapter 9, lesson 10, thank you. And at the end of this lesson, we'll consider the Isthmus Games. This is one of the pictures from it, where Paul considers his faith in comparison to these games. These games were going on, I read, in Greece before Romans even had their Olympics. And there's a picture of a temple that the Greeks used to worship Apollos, or one of those other gods. Some refreshment here. Remember, this chapter 9, it says concerning the meat sacrificed by idols, which is a continuing thought, but really he's going to go on and talk about his personal sacrifices in order to carry out the gospel message. And we have to also remember that in the beginning of this chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul opens up with this divisions. Some said they were of Apollos. Some said they were of Cephas or Peter. And remember, Paul said, I thank God that I baptized none of you. And so these people would come through. We're going to see in this lesson Peter with his wife. And they were supported by this congregation. Remember, this church was within the trading sector, one of the big sectors of the world at that time. And so I would surmise that they were all pretty well off. And so they look, this argument comes up that, well, you must not even be an apostle. And so there's this back and forth that we don't see going on here, where Paul is really, I think, getting frustrated with this at this time. They had all kind of problems, and one that we talked about last week was they seemed to be without love. And so the love of the gospel and the love of the Christians is in Paul's mind as he writes this section to the church, I think. And it's a marathon. He compares himself to a runner because of the things he has to endure, not only from the outside world, but from fellow Christians. And so those things are in mind, and we need to remember that Paul's talking to people that are used to supporting other evangelists that came through, and he's not accepting their support. So it's going to be a theme of this lesson, and the backdrop to remind you is how this chapter opened up, how they were calling themselves, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Apollos. And this section was introduced, remember, with eating of meats and the sacrifice to idols. And there were some that were having trouble with others eating the meats sacrificed to idols. Remember, the Hebrews did that, but the Greeks that left this group who sacrificed idols or meats to other idols, they had left that, so to see others partaking in that bothered them. So in this section, we're going to consider Paul as examining his own life to them and the liberties that he has and the sacrifices that he endures. In other words, his self-denial. And it is a condition for his own salvation. So his life is one of an example of sacrifice. It should be familiar to us. And he's going to go into this right to support the preaching. And I myself have never examined this hard to see all the scripture that is in there for supporting those that give themselves to the gospel message, which, we do. And for those of us who can afford to do that. And so this section opens up with the first verse that I'm going to read from the American Standard. Am I not free? Redundantly asking. Am I not an apostle? A redundant question, or rhetorical, I mean. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? And so he's answering this question that's coming up as to his apostleship. And the picture I showed you in the beginning was a seal. We're all sealed with that right of redemption that the day Jesus comes back, we're told we're sealed with that upon baptism. He had a seal of apostleship. And so I put that picture up in the beginning. That seal was the seal of what a king would put on a letter that he would send somewhere, not to be opened by anybody, a wax seal with his signification on there, maybe you would say. In this case, I think the C might represent Christians or Corinthians. And so we open up with this, and we'll start out by reading now. And we're going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 2 through 7, since I just read the first verse to you. And Jean, are you comfortable with reading that today? We'll start.
If I am not considered an apostle, a special messenger by others, at least I am one of you to you, for you are the seal, the certificate, the living evidence of my apostleship in the Lord, confirming it. This is my real ground of defense, my verification of myself to those who have put me on trial and cross-examined me. Have we not the right to our own food and drink at the expense of the church? Have we not the right also to take along with us a Christian sister as a wife, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas and Paul? Or is it on Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from doing any manual labor for a livelihood in order to go about the work of the ministry? Consider this, what soldier at any time serves at his own expense, Who plants a vineyard and does not eat any of the fruit of it? Who tends a flock and does not partake of the milk of the flock?
Let's see.
I went through 7.
Oh, okay. I got you. I like your version. If you want to, Evelyn, you want to read 8 through 11? We'll move around a little bit. It's a long reading.
Do I say this merely from the human point of view? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you?
Okay, you want to read that?
If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel.
Thank you. Okay, a rather long reading. He argues here on several things. It almost seems that there's some arguing that he should not be compensated, Barnabas should not be compensated. Others might even be saying none of them should be compensated for their life being given to the gospel message and carrying it out. And so he goes on to talk about Peter, which is mentioned here as Cephas, and how he carried along his wife. And so they are both left their occupations to dedicate themselves to the life of the gospel message, which we see today, many do. And it is a joint forced effort. He talks then about the analogy of a soldier and flock. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox. We'll look into that scripture. And he's talking about sowing spiritual things here, which although the metaphors he's using are carnal, he uses this kind of message about the gospel message. So he says, first of all, he is an apostle. He's a different type of apostle. He wasn't there with the other apostles when they were living a ministry with Christ. In fact, we know in Acts that he actually persecuted these Christians. But we know then on the road to Damascus, he was changed. And he had seen the Lord, he says. He actually saw him from heaven. Or for someone up there. So your commentary says you're almost forced with the conclusion, yes, that you didn't have a question, did you?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I don't understand exactly. Do they actually get paid? They don't get. Do they get a salary from the other churches, or what is? Back when I was young, the preachers did not get paid. They all had jobs. They worked jobs. That was, So back then, it wasn't the same way.
Well, first of all, looking at the first century, these people were definitely supported by the churches. And Paul's going to tell you that he's supported by other churches of Christ.
Okay.
And so they didn't have, all of them didn't have dual occupations. However, Paul did. Remember, he was a tent maker. And so we see in examples today that some are dual employment, like the ones that speak here. We all are either retired or have other jobs. And it's economics. It's a matter of affordability. Some churches with a larger congregation in today's world can afford to pay a husband and a wife or Sometimes they're even single, but they've dedicated their lives to the gospel. They've dedicated their lives to studying and to the carrying out the gospel message. But in this study, it really opened my eyes up to it. I haven't really examined it this closely. It really supports all those ideas that you're coming up with. Those are all scriptural. And for any to argue today that we shouldn't pay the ministers, just not what Paul's talking about here. Any other comments? Anyone other? Yes, Bill?
It talks about the elders with that word double honor.
Yeah.
And so an elder can be doing a lot of work, and he's to be paid.
Yeah. There's
And
elders of the day.
And there's some that today, given that a bad name because of some of these TV personalities, they're living up in a mansion up somewhere, and even some of the major denominations, their ministers and things, they say, is that Christ? You know, is that Christ? Because they're overdoing it. They're become a central figure, so then they say we need more, and they take it and giving the church Christianity a bad name because these preachers are getting too much, or demanding too much, or whatever.
Yeah, Bill's messages and some of these evangelists you see on television today, and they're not all on television, but they actually claim that that if they're doing the right thing, they're going to be rewarded by God. And if they're not driving the best car on the street, then they're not doing things right. And it's a more of a cash in, cash out message. But most of the preachers that we see, we pay them just above the poverty level. In fact, I was reading a magazine this morning, and there's a section looking for preachers, and said base salary is $36,000. Well, that's below the poverty level to these days. And then others offer a home with 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, but I've been in one of those homes before. I don't know if I don't want to carry on there. It's kind of depressing. So sometimes we don't really fulfill the needs, I think. We don't consider some of the needs that they have. And so some of that is there's a lot of dearth in the ministry today. We don't have a lot of preachers because it's so tough. Not to mention how thankless it can be at times. Which apparently was what Paul's working through here. And so
Consider he had a wife.
Paul didn't have a wife. Peter did. So he uses all those comparisons. And that's one of his arguments, is because I don't have a wife, you don't want to pay me. So he starts out with his apostolatory seal, and he actually used that word seal. But he is not accepting their support. Does anybody remember what he said about that? We'll get there, but why he refused their support? So they wouldn't boast. He talks a lot about being puffed up in these chapters. And this is contrary to the usual practice, even of roving philosophers, your commentary says, and that they wanted to pay him. So that's an offense. He actually addresses it again in 2 Corinthians. It's brought up in your book, so I bring it up here again. I've committed an offense in abasing myself, in other words, lowering my standards, that ye might be exalted. Because I've preached the gospel to you for free. And I've robbed other churches, taking wages of them, he says. So he is saying he's getting support, just not from this church. And I imagine he didn't need a lot of support because he was a dual occupier of other jobs. And so he says, I was charged by no man. Some of his support came from Macedonia. And so he says all these things, and also that I'm not a burden to you. And to stop the boasting. He goes on to use Peter or Cephas as an example. So don't I have the same right that you've given Peter? and this is addressed in your commentary, that we won't go into it in great detail, but there's some organized groups today that believe that the minister shouldn't be married. And they hold up Peter as some examples, the first one, but yet he was married. And here's some more proof of it. Not only did Jesus heal his sick mother-in-law, but here we see in Corinthians where Peter was traveling with his wife from Jerusalem and apparently visited here. And they gave him support for him and his wife to be there. So that's interesting. And not only Peter, but the Lord's brothers, which must have been James at least. And so he says, Paul, myself and Barnabas, don't we have the same right? So apparently some were arguing you shouldn't be paid. Some were asking, why aren't you asking for payment? So it must have been a time for him to work through all this. Okay, now we're going to go into the next reading. This is 9:7 through 14. I'm going to read it.
Where does this start?
Verse 7. You want to read that? Yeah.
Consider this, what soldier at this time serves at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat any of the fruit of it? Who tends a flock and does not partake of the milk of the flock? Do I say this only on human authority and as a man and man's reason? Does not the law endorse the same principle? For in the law of Moses it is written, you shall not muzzle an ox when it's tending out the corn. It is only for the oxen that God cares. Or does he speak certainly and eternally for our sake? Assured it is written for our sake, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher ought to thresh in expectation of partaking of the harvest.
Okay, Laura, you want to read 11 through 14, please?
Sure. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel.
Okay, thank you. So he goes into this matter more, but remember he is talking here about sacrifice so that others won't stumble. And that's a continued theme from the last chapter where he used meats offered to idols. Here he's using the idea of taking pay so that others wouldn't stumble or be confused by it. But he goes on to argue his right to do it as he makes comparisons with the soldier, the one that tends the vineyard, the shepherd. All these things, and even the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 25:4, where Moses teaches the same concept. So he argues strongly for the matter that he should and could, he and Barnabas, but he doesn't. He goes on to talk about living the gospel, and your commentary references Luke 10:7, where Jesus sent out 72 by 2. And if you remember, he told them not to take anything with them except for the shoes on their feet and a cloak, and to rely completely on God and faith and those that would take them in and support them. And so he argues here that he has the same right, he and Barnabas, and he argues against carnal things which are lesser than spiritual things. And it goes on to reference 2 Corinthians 12:20. To me, that wasn't real clear, so I didn't put it in there. Now we'll go on to the next reading. We're going to read 1 Corinthians 9:15 through 23. And we'll start with 15 through 17. Evelyn, would you want to read that section?
But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me.
Thank you. Gene, you want to read 18 through 20? 18 through 20. What? Chapter 9.
What verse?
18 and then 20, just through 20. It's a long reading.
When then is his actual reward that I get? Just this, that my preaching the good news, the gospel, I may offer it absolutely free of no expense to anyone, not taking advantage of my rights and privileges as a preacher of the gospel. For although I am free in every way from anyone's control, I have made myself a bondservant to everyone, so I might gain more for Christ. The Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To men under the law it becomes, as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law.
Okay, thank you. And Laura, you will read 21 through 23.
To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you.
All right, thank you. So after he makes his argument about how he should be, it could be compensated, he states the reason why he's not going to take his right to be support for men. And he says he's free from all things, but he's made himself a bond servant for the case of the gospel. And he makes a strong statement here in 9:15 that he'd rather die than lose grounds to their boasting. We often use an expression similar to that today. So he's not mincing any words there. In 16, he has been appointed by the Lord himself to preach the gospel. And woe is to him if he doesn't, he's saying here. But in 17, he says, I do it willingly. And I have my reward, but if submitted against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed to me. So he's doing these things freely, and he's got a higher goal in mind. He says, I serve at my own expense without compensation, and this is a voluntary service to the Lord, so that no one can take away my cause for glory. So he's going to forego his liberty. He's free from all men, but he's made himself a servant to all, that he might gain some. He goes on to say when he's working with those that are under the law, or still believe in the law, or come from the law of Moses, he tries to comply with them. But those that are not under the law, then he will live like those that are not under the law. some that says in your commentary, misunderstand this, that we don't have any law to live under, but we do. He says that we live under the law of Christ. James 4:12 tells us that, the law of liberty.
So is he saying preachers should get paid, or they should, or like?
Yeah, he's saying they should get paid. He's foregoing it, though. It's a personal decision, as if he's dedicated himself to the Lord. He's accepting compensation from other churches, which would give us an example today. We call it support of missionaries.
Or an evangelist come to the church, or I know they pay them.
We support evangelism. Sometimes we have them come here and speak. There's some cases where we have ministers or preachers that reside at one location. They have dual incomes. They might accept some from the church. Others, churches are, well off enough they can support a full-time evangelist. And all those things are given clearance here by Paul under inspiration.
There is another issue that makes it very difficult for preachers. I was a professional person. I made good money, and so I preached without compensation. An old preacher said, "Calvin, I understand your heart, but you really make it hard on those who come after you who do not have that kind of income."
Right.
And from then on, no matter where I preached, I made sure that I was paid. It's easy to receive it. It's easy to give it back.
Yeah.
And you avoid that.
Yeah.
But in a society such as ours, that income assures that these preachers are going to be receiving a better income under Social Security than when they retire.
Right.
And another thing, while we're on the subject of preachers, you remember that when the widows at Jerusalem, the Grecian widows, were being neglected, the apostle said, it's not reasonable. It does not make sense for us to stop doing our work in order to wait on tables. We can really take advantage of a preacher by saying, well, he's not doing anything this week. He can take me here, he can take me there. A preacher has a very fine line they have to walk in an effort to please everybody.
Yeah.
And we in the congregation owe it to our preachers to make sure they don't have anything to do except preach and teach. But then again, the preachers need to be counseled by the elders that they are not just paid to preach on Sunday. Their foremost work is the personal work that they do during the week.
Absolutely.
And so if we hire a preacher, we should always understand our responsibility to that man and his family. And if we don't, then we might have some explaining to do on the day of judgment.
Right.
It's not easy to be a preacher, as you well know.
Yeah. I've never been one, but I know I couldn't do it for a lot of those reasons you just mentioned. We have a couple former preachers in the audience, and it's a very tough job, and it goes on very unappreciated. You make up an important point. If you don't accept compensation, and Paul's bringing that up here too, I think they're saying the same thing. Well, if we don't pay you, why do we pay any of them? And he's saying, I'm getting compensated. You just don't see it directly. But just as you mentioned, he can't win here. And unfortunately, the same thing it's very, very relevant today. And, we've been through some tough points here, just the short time I've been here, where there's some cases we just can't afford it anymore. And so that person needs to move to somewhere where they have a larger congregation. So we have that aspect going on too. Bill? You don't have anything to say to this, do you?
What you said about that, we're not in the Bible Belt. Wisconsin is you're kind of out of the Bible Belt. Yeah. And so they would, Texas and Tennessee, people that were strong, they send a preacher up, and they support him in the congregation. Yeah. But then they wanted the transition. They wanted the local congregation to pick up, eventually realize they need to support a preacher, Yeah. And so then that process was kind of a slow thing sometimes, because people say, well, we got it made, they're sending preachers up here, and they're free, and all this. But no, you guys, we're just doing this for temporary. You're going to have to support the preacher, So it was kind of a training situation where people, it's like here in Corinth, they had to learn their responsibility. And so these verses would come up, in the process to show you guys need to, pick up your part, You can't just be taking free preachers all the time, it's not going to last. And so that was a kind of a thing when you're not in the Bible Belt, where there wasn't a lot of money, or there wasn't a lot of people, that they eventually would have to pick up and support.
That's a great point too. You see Paul going around to the churches and appointing elders everywhere he went. But I've mentioned several times, I don't see any discussion here of elders in this church. And in fact, it seems to me there's not. And he might not have been able to get anybody spiritually mature enough to get to that point that he could appoint them as elders, and much less understand the compensation value of somebody that's dedicated themselves to the gospel. Michael and I know one missionary goes to India, and his whole goal is to set up these churches that become self-reliant and not continually expect the support of the American churches to keep them going. So his goal is to set up a structure that they can start supporting themselves, which is, I think, what you're talking about.
But
Yeah.
that's even a fine line for a preacher. There's, not fine. But, for instance, this one preacher makes over $90,000 a year in town, 90,000. Several rental properties, 5, 6, 7. He has the elders working on the rental properties and his vehicles and stuff. So you look at that and say, well, it's me.
Yeah. Yeah, Bill mentioned that a little bit a while ago, is sometimes that the love of money becomes the root of all evil, instead of considering it as a fair value. So it's both sides of it. A lot of times we can undercompensate the preacher, not only physically but spiritually, underappreciate them, expect them to go out and visit the sick and do this and that, is what Calvin's talking about, I believe, where we all have a role there to visit the sick and the elderly, and so we end up dumping everything on the paid preacher. Well, you're the only one's getting paid here, so you do it all. And then you might have other cases, and I can say I've seen it, where that's all we see the preacher doing is preaching. Don't see him going out and visiting anybody or knocking on doors or anything. So, yeah, we could spend a lot of time on this area. Okay, let's read 1 Corinthians 9, 26 through 27 now. And Evelyn, you want to carry on that one for me? Or actually, it's 24 through 25.
Know ye not that they that run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? Even so run that ye may attain. And every man that striveth in the games exercises self-control in all things. Now they do it to receive a corruptible crown, but we are incorruptible.
All right, Jean, do you want to read 26 and 27, 1 Corinthians chapter 9?
I therefore so run as not uncertainly, so fight. I as not beating the air, but I buffet my body, and I bring it into bondage, lest by any means after that I have preached to others, I myself should be rejected.
Okay, thank you. And these passages are pretty familiar to us. He's comparing the Olympic Games or the Isthmus Games, which I said before was the Greeks did it before the Romans. So he makes this comparison about what he's doing. As your commentary says, the Olympic Games were first played on Grecian soil, and so these allusions would be very fresh in their mind. And he's requesting that the strong members forego their rights to eat meat in the chapter before for the sake of the weak. And he's making the same example here about where he receives payment from those that are weak. And those of you that have been ministers, gone through all these things, sometimes you have to sacrifice some things for the sake of the gospel and work through some members that don't understand the roles that are brought on by the gospel preacher. So he goes on to forego that. I think we already covered this, but it goes into some great detail, some other pictures of these games and the things that went on there. So it talks about the Isthmus Games and the Greek athletic festivals that were held every 4th year. So the Isthmus Festival is what he uses here, they think. And it was full view of the city of Corinth. So these festivals were held in other areas, and they built temples and all kind of things to handle this. Okay, quickly moving along, as we seem to run out of time. We got some questions. And take on the first 3 here. What theme is developed in chapter 9? What qualifications did Paul cite to demonstrate that he was an apostle? And what proof is found that Peter was not a pope? I don't really answer that. Lori?
Well, Paul was showing that his own conduct has been to forego the use of his liberties to win more to Christ. And as far as being apostle, he had seen Jesus, and the Corinthians were his work in the Lord. And Peter could not be a pope because he was married.
Thank you. You covered it very well. This whole chapter he's addressing the strong brother. Not to abuse your liberties, destroy the weak, and he uses himself as his own example. And I don't think that he would even spend as much time as he did on this whole subject of compensation except to demonstrate a point. And he calls attention to the fact that, and I say I've never noticed this in this great detail, how Peter apparently traveled with his wife. And he apparently traveled here. They were very familiar with it. What's contrary to the Catholic doctrine that the perpetual state of the Virgin Mary? And how does it show in 9:5 that that's not true? Yeah. Jesus had brothers. We know that Jesus was the first because she was conceived of Jesus as a virgin. But the idea that she's, and we may not be as familiar with this as somebody coming out of Catholicism, but apparently they promote the idea that she was always a virgin, which I don't quite understand. What proofs does Paul use to demonstrate that those that preach the gospel have a right to live the gospel? In other words, completely dependent on those who support that.
Wasn't he proven that they could take a wife if they wished?
Yes, he used that example by Peter, and then he makes comparisons in the physical state. He uses the support of this comparison of the soldier They were very familiar with that. We do the same. Those that worked the vineyard, they were paid, and they took some of the vineyard for themselves. The shepherd, and then he closes with the law of Moses. I skipped 6 because it's kind of redundant. I thought 7, the Lord Jesus ordained that they should preach the gospel and live the gospel. That was another question, and we covered that. Or I didn't skip it, that's on there. 6 and 7, I didn't skip either. I did skip a couple. Why did Paul choose not to use the right to be supported while he was preaching in chapter 9, 15 through 18? What excuse did he use? Remember, he said, I'd rather die than take your money so that you don't boast. So it was really the boasting of it that he didn't want to suffer. And why was the necessity to preach the gospel message laid on Paul? Why and how? Remember, it was on the road to Damascus, really, that
Well, it's necessary for him to preach the gospel because that's what God laid upon him was.
that's right, Christ laid upon him. Yep, exactly. Is the same kind of necessity laid upon others? No. He was under a special dispensation. And why was he willing to forego his liberties?
He made himself a bondservant.
Yeah. Bondservant to the Lord, and free from the things of what man might lay on him, which for those retired preachers in the audience, I'm sure you could also talk about that. Well, we pay you, we'll tell you what to do, and all those kind of things that could come up. Christians can be some of the worst at times to deal with. I say that out of love. List some things that Paul might have done while working among the Jews that he would not have done while working among the Gentiles. So remember, he takes examples of when he was a Jew, he lived like a Jew. When he was a Gentile, he lived like a Gentile when he was with them. What are some of the things he did when he was working with the Jews?
He became a Jew.
And specifically, your commentary brings up the fact that he even had Timothy circumcised so that he could take him in the temple so that he wouldn't become a stumbling block to those, although Timothy didn't need to be. One of the things that, what did he do when he was working with the Gentiles? Lori?
He would have insisted that they keep Jewish laws such as sacrifices for sins and keeping festivals and feasts and certain days and things like that because it was no longer needed, but he definitely wouldn't have done it with the Gentiles.
Right, so he, there were 3 festivals. They were probably still going on at this time that he could have, in the Roman church, there was a big argument there he got involved in that they wanted the new members and new Christians to be circumcised. So all those things he didn't, but the biggest one was in the last chapter. He went without eating the meats offered to the pagan idols, which he argues in that last chapter they're not even gods. They think they are, but they're not. But remember, the Jews would eat the meat sacrificed, so he went ahead. This whole thing, in my mind, keeps bringing up to the fact that even Peter, remember, he withdrew from eating with the Gentiles, and Paul called him out on that. And it doesn't sound like he went up to him one by one either. It sounds like he called him out in the group. So this was a problem still, even among his brother Cephas. What is the guiding principle motivating Paul? Yeah, he's going to argue his own salvation, I heard. He's a servant to Christ. But actually, it's so he can gain more too, he says. What other principle motivated him to forego his liberties? And that's his salvation. His own personal salvation. And we see that today. We often see people seem to forget that their salvation's involved too. What kind of self-control and self-denial does an athlete endure to compete, as he uses the runner and the games as his final comparison? What's a runner have to do to be able to run? Yes, Lori?
Well, he probably has a training schedule, and he probably has certain things that he eats, certain things he doesn't eat, certain things he doesn't do, just because he knows his body's got to be in tip-top shape.
Right. So he uses that physical comparison of preparing for the marathon, and there were those that would do all kind of things I'm sure they were aware of that were around them as they were preparing to run a race, and that we have to be in the same condition, and what we are going to receive is a crown also, but ours is not corruptible, and to keep reminding them to be fixed on the goal. What reward does he get for competing? What kinds of self-denial might a Christian be compelled to make? Memories.
No, only Christ can hold fast to him.
Exactly. So you bring your whole spiritual body and your physical body in subjection. He talks about the body and the spirit as being one in previous chapters we looked at, so that we might obtain a crown. And then he goes on to talk about even the boxer doesn't just beat the air, but he's designed to withstand blows. So his body might be buffeted by these conditions. What does he get for his self-denial? And what does 926 teach?
Eternal salvation.
So he runs, not uncertainly, not as a fight beating the air, but he's running a race, and here it says it might be also the idea of apostasy, that we could turn away from. Otherwise, we could lose the race. And it asks you here, what's the definition of a castaway in your...
Someone shipped or deserted on an island. The castaways, remember?
Yeah, deserted, cast away on an island. Strong says it's a negative participle, so it's sort of on the negative. It's unapproved and rejected, worthlessness, reprobate, so we can't be cast away. Next week, Lord willing, I'm under 5 minutes to spare. Lesson number 11, chapter 10. He's going to go back on to the sacrifice of meats. Thank you.